Welcome into the GSMC College Football Podcast presented by the GSMC Sports Network. We have a great show for you today. We're going to start with the battle between Florida State and the ACC. Feels like a very ongoing battle in the court system to see if Florida State can get out of the ACC a little bit earlier than the ACC would like. And then we will get into what seems to be somewhat of a problem in the college football coaching world. A lot of coaches moving to the NFL, a lot of coaches finding their way to the SEC or Big Ten. I will get into all of that. And then we will get into the best coaching hires of this cycle. There have been a couple that I felt have stood out above the pack, so I will break down those. And then finally, we have our very first Top 10 Tuesday today, and I have obviously started with my top 10 teams for the 2024 season, my way too early, as they say, top 10. A couple of surprises in there, so let me know what you think in the comments. But before we start, I do want to bring to your attention, we have a ton of different tips or different questions that come in throughout the show, and the best way for us to see those and to answer those effectively is to use the link at the bottom of the screen, streamelements.com/gsmcsportsnetwork./tip. It's a huge help not only to us, but to you all to see your questions on the screen and get answered as quickly as possible. So definitely use that if you would like to leave a question. But let's jump right in. The ACC and Florida State are currently battling in the court system. Obviously, you have definitely heard murmurs of this if you've been following college football at all, but it's a very complex issue, and I'll be totally honest, I've been a little bit confused when looking at different stuff around it, but I'm not a lawyer, so let's try to break this down as simply as possible and let you guys know what you need to know about this issue. I think the important thing to know is, first of all, when this all started, and the real answer to that is obviously when a lot of stuff started for Florida State on the day that the playoff rankings were revealed a year ago. I think a lot of people around Florida State took stock of a lot of different things right around then, and I think especially being left out for a team like Alabama, who wasn't an undefeated team and was in the SEC. I think there were a lot of people at Florida State that kind of saw somewhat of a writing on the wall that the SEC or the Big Ten are always going to get preferential treatment over smaller conferences, or at least that's how they have felt. So they decided they wanted out of the ACC. They had seen all these other teams take their opportunity to get to the SEC, Texas and Oklahoma joining this year, and then you got the Big Ten adding USC, UCLA, Oregon, Washington. So they see all these teams finding their way to a better conference and say they want a piece of that. So they decided then that they were going to sue the ACC for to get released from their grant of rights. Now the grant of rights is mainly their media rights deal with the ESPN that they signed in 2016 that runs all the way through 2036. Now this is a very, very long media rights deal, especially in today's age of college football. They definitely do shorter term contracts because the amount of money in media today changes very drastically, especially in the sports space. So it is a little bit insane that this is that long term of a contract, but that's the way it's set up currently. And Florida State would have to pay just an insane amounts of money to get out of that contract. There have been different numbers thrown around. I've seen anything up to about $525 million all the way down to about $400 million that they would have to pay currently to get out of the ACC. They are obviously arguing that this is an absurd number and cannot be the actual impact of Florida State leaving the conference. So that is currently what they're battling over. And one of the big contentious area points, at least recently, has been where will this case take place. I think currently it is set to take place in North Carolina, but Florida State is fighting tooth and nail to have it fought in Florida, which makes total sense. Obviously, you want to be on your home turf when arguing a case like this, and the ACC the same. So they want to be in North Carolina where their headquarters are. Florida State wants to be in Florida, which makes sense from both sides. And I think one of the big things to keep in mind here is throughout all of conference realignment, throughout of all of this, craziness over the last couple of years, all it's really taken is a couple of people at a school or at an organization wanting a change, right? So Texas and Oklahoma, when they made that decision to jump over to the SEC, they made that decision. There was no one that was going to get in their way of making that decision, I guess is the best way to put this. When, people with the amount of money that Texas and Oklahoma have, or in this case, Florida State have, and the people with as much, influence and power over the sport that Florida State and Texas and Oklahoma and all of these teams that have moved around over the last couple of years have had, they're going to find a way to move. So I think that's something to keep in mind here. I think a little selfishly, I wish the ACC would kind of win and be able to keep Florida State around because for the sport, I think it is in its best interest to be different, to be regional, to be have Florida State, fighting it out with Miami in their own conference, and that's still a possibility. Just them not in the ACC anymore. So I'm a big fan of the Power Five conferences, the classic setup that we've had for a really long time now, but that's obviously coming to an end to a certain extent, and it could change even more with this addition to the mix because let's be totally honest, if Florida State finds a way to pull this off, there's other teams in the ACC that will follow suit very quickly. It should come as no surprise to anyone that Clemson is following this very, very closely. So is North Carolina, so is Virginia, Miami, even Georgia Tech. There's tons of teams across the ACC that are watching this very closely because if the ACC loses, there's a chance that, all these other teams come out of the woodwork very quickly and say, well, if Florida State's getting a better deal down the road, why can't we? And they will definitely find a way to probably finagle their way out of the conference as well. But I don't think they necessarily mind Florida State being the people out in front of this right now. Obviously, Florida State, the topic of conversation around the sport for a really long time now. Obviously, Michigan winning the title was the biggest deal for a time. Nick Saban retiring, there have been tons of different stories, but Florida State has been tied into pretty much every story since the end of college football season, even going back to that playoff selection show. It has been the Florida State show in a lot of ways, and you do wonder, I guess, in this craziness that is going on around them, can Florida State, the football team, just sit down and totally lock in on the season? We talked about it yesterday. Spring practice is going to be very, very important for them. They got to get DJ Uiagalelei underway. They have to get him ready to go, and there's a lot of stuff riding on that. So with all of this stuff happening around them, obviously Mike Norvell, an elite coach, an elite motivator of his guys, so I'm not necessarily worried about his ability to get his guys focused and get his guys prepared. But this is an extra distraction to deal with. There is that added element of all of those players going into, whether it's their freshman, sophomore, or junior season, thinking, am I going to be playing in the ACC after this year, or am I going to be playing around my home area in a lot of ways? So a lot of change is definitely coming in the college football world. We've seen that over the last couple of years. Started with Texas OU, obviously, and has really snowballed since then. But the question for the ACC is, if you lose this, what happens next? We've talked about the other teams that are watching this very closely, and if you're the ACC, you could very well look like the Pac-12 in a couple of years here. We talked about it yesterday. It happens very quickly. George Kliavkoff is officially out as the Pac-12 commissioner, and it's because he wasn't able to keep his teams around. He wasn't able to get a media rights deal that made them happy enough to continue to be in the conference, and I think that's something that the ACC is going to have to look at and really take stock of, because it happens very quickly. He was hired in 2021, George Kliavkoff, and has been fired less than 3 years later and has lost 10 teams in the process. So It's something that the ACC is going to have to be very cognizant of, and in the coming month or so, they're going to have to, really buckle down and, for their sake, win this case, because if Florida State wins, which I'm not necessarily at I'm not sure which way this is gonna go. I'm no law expert or anything like that, but I tend to believe that Florida State will find a way out. I talked about it before. Motivated people with a lot of money in the sport tend to find a way to get their way in a lot of ways. So I think Florida State will find a way. I think it will be some type of settlement between, the crazy $400 million figure and Florida State's ideal scenario, which is leave for free and find their way to the SEC or the Big Ten and go on their merry way. But it will be interesting to see what those numbers are. Obviously, it'll be interesting to see not only what happens in this court case, but also, let's say Florida State does find a way to win and get their way out of a conference, who's willing to take them on. They have created a lot of storylines in college football, have, I don't want to say made a lot of enemies, but there have been a lot of people that haven't been necessarily super happy with Florida State in the last little bit, whether that's the College Football Playoff Committee or whoever else, the ACC currently. But I wonder, will the SEC jump at this chance to have a team like Florida State, which I think fits really well into the niche of the SEC, or will they say it's not really worth having this team that has created a lot of publicity and sometimes negative publicity around them? Now, if I was in the SEC conversations, I'd say let's take Florida State and not bat another eye, but that is something to think about, because there are two real conferences that everyone wants to be in, and if one of those two doesn't take you, where are you left, kind of? So it'll be interesting to see how that develops for sure. But currently the battle is set for March 22nd in North Carolina. So buckle up. The last two off seasons have been littered with conference realignment. I don't think this is going to be any different. I think Florida State will win this battle, and then the floodgates might just open on the ACC. But we will absolutely be tracking that more as it goes along. Will probably be a relatively long process. It's already taken a couple of months here since they've sued and countersued. So it'll be interesting to see how all of this develops. But we will keep you up to date with that. But we're going to take a short break here before we get to somewhat of a coaching crisis in college football right now. But we're going to take a short break, and we will be right back.
I feel like I'm losing my mind. Is everybody in the world blind? Please, Lord, give me a sign, a sign. I feel like I'm losing my mind. Is everybody in the world blind? Please, Lord, give me a sign, a sign. I wanna be the greatest. Everybody on the fake shit. I look around and feel like everybody is the fakest. I make this every day and I'm impatient, hoping one day I blow up from the basement. Statement, the top is so vacant. I don't hear shit that I think is amazing. Waiting for my day when I'm playing sold out shows for 1,000 faces. Hey, give me that crown, get in my way and to be put down. It ain't your place, all this my sound. If I want that shit, then I'll get it right now. I'm losing it, the noose it fits, some losing shit, a stupid myth. You choose to live or choose to dip, you choose to fight or lose your grip and lose a gift. Oh, I feel like I'm losing my mind. Is everybody in the world blind? Please, Lord, give me a sign, a sign. I feel like I'm losing my mind. Is everybody in the world?
Alrighty, welcome back, everyone. We just talked about the craziness going on in between the ACC and Florida State. They are currently battling out in the courts to see if Florida State can get out of their grant of rights deal. And now we're going to talk about a little bit of a coaching crisis going on in college football. But before we get into that, I do want to remind you that we get a ton of different tips throughout the show We get a ton of different questions, and the best way to get your questions seen on screen and answer it as quickly as possible is to use the link down below, streamelements.com/gsmcsportsnetwork./tip. It is a huge help not only to us, but to you all to see what you ask on the screen, and I can get to it as quickly as possible. So if you use that function, you can definitely get your question answered and possibly have, a fun little back and forth here. But let's jump back into what has been kind of an interesting little time in college football. A lot of different problems popping up around the sport. A lot of people not having a ton of optimism in terms of the future of this sport. And there have been times where I've been among that group, and I'm not necessarily going to help those beliefs right now, but I will try to subside a little bit of worry towards the end of this segment. But let's jump right in, because we've had a ton of coaches find their way either to the NFL or to the SEC and the Big Ten, leaving behind what seemed like bigger, better jobs in a lot of ways. And we'll start with the guys going to the NFL. Obviously, we had Jeff Hafley leave Boston College to take over the defensive coordinator position at the Green Bay Packers. Brian McClendon, a really, really talented wide receiver coach at Georgia, has left to join the Buccaneers. Also, Liam Cohen has joined the Buccaneers as their OC, leaving Kentucky, who had in the past been the Rams OC, so not quite as surprising there, but still something to keep a track of. And then obviously Ryan Grubb taking the job back up in Seattle after what was probably about 5 seconds living in Tuscaloosa, Alabama. But tons of guys have been leaving for the NFL, and I think it's a very interesting feeling when people are leaving to go to the NFL to have a better work-life balance. There have been a lot of guys that have been a little bit turned off in recent years to just the amount of work that goes into being a college football coach. Now, obviously, they get paid pretty handsomely to do that work, but there's only so many hours in a day, and more money does not buy you more time, and there are times of the year where coaches are just up against it. Particularly December has been kind of the poster child for how kind of broken the schedule and the structure of college football has been over the last couple of years. December is an absolute nightmare for coaches in a lot of ways. They have to recruit high school kids. They have to recruit the transfer portal. They have to recruit their own kids, which is something that not as many people talk about, but you have to keep your own kids in the building now. There's no longer this ability to just show up to practice and know that all of your guys are going to be there, because tons of stuff is happening behind the scenes with NIL and the transfer portal, and some teams not, adhering to certain rules that are in place with the transfer portal. So there's a lot of things that they have to do just in terms of roster management. And then you get into coaching. Then you get into preparing for a bowl game, going through bowl practices, dealing with the media days for all of that stuff, travel, all of these different things around bowl season that just put coaches in a really, really bad spot, at least to do their job to the best of their ability, because everything culminates in that last couple of months of the season, right? Obviously, November is huge high-pressure games where they're working crazy hours to make sure their team has any type of edge. They're hosting kids on weekends, on visits. They're doing tons of stuff during the back end of the season. And then we get to December, and they have a chance to, at least they should have a chance to breathe for a second. If you didn't make a bowl game, you should be able to have a second to figure out what the next step is for your team. There are a lot of teams going through transition, and it's insane that a guy that has just finished the season, has just finished the incredible grind that this 12 or 13 games is through September to November, that then they have to go through what is the most grueling month in all of the sport. I think if you asked pretty much any coach out there, they would tell you they much prefer September and October to December when it comes to coaching this sport, because at the end of the day, at least in September, October, when they're doing recruiting and all of this different type of stuff, they get to coach football a lot of the times. And in December, that's a little bit fewer and further between. And I think it's been a really frustrating thing for coaches. So the NFL has looked like a very viable option for the future of their career. And obviously, going up to the NFL is never a bad idea. Obviously, it's the highest level of football, and there are plenty of coaches that just want to be NFL coaches. So it's not to say that all of these guys were definitely going to stay in college football if they, if this structure and scheduling was changed. But there are tons of guys that would have at least been a part of the future of this sport in a lot of ways. Brian McClendon being one of them. I think he would have been a huge. Ryan Grubb, another one. All of these guys that are uber talented football coaches and have a chance to be head coaches in college football in the future and be kind of the next generation of great coaches are leaving because it's kind of unsustainable to be any type of coach in college football at the moment, especially a higher level, whether that's Jeff Hafley as a head coach or Ryan Grubb as an OC or Liam Cohen as an OC. There's a lot on these guys' shoulders, especially around this time of year. So when those job offers from the Seahawks or from the Buccaneers or from the Packers start rolling in, it's hard to say no. With all of this stuff happening around you, working pretty much 16-hour days no matter what, probably more than that, to be totally honest with you. It's just, it's an unfair thing to expect these coaches to pull off. And obviously, they're in a very advantageous position that a lot of us would trade with them immediately. But the reality is, I don't think a lot of us understand what that reality actually is. They go into work way too early. They leave work way too late. They spend way too little time with their family. And it's something that just has to be fixed at least the best it can. Obviously, when you coach elite level football, if you want to be elite in this sport, especially in today's world of fundraising and transfer portal and everything else, you're going to have to work a lot. There's no two ways about that. Every coach would tell you that. But every coach would also tell you there are ways to create a better environment for them to do their job effectively. I think one of the biggest ones would be just having one signing day in February, make that the main event again, instead of having two signing days and creating this absolute gold rush essentially in December and late November that takes a lot away from the actual football being played. And it goes back to a lot of people devaluing what bowl games mean to a lot of people, and it creates problems when you look at not only the bowl game, marketability and viewership and all of that type of stuff, but also bowl games are a lot of what make this sport incredible, right? There are different things that I know a lot of people this past year loved the Pop-Tart Bowl. So did I. It was incredible. And I think that's part of what makes all of this sport just awesome. There's so many different sides of it. There's so many different layers to it. And we're slowly kind of losing those layers because of all of the different stuff that has been introduced. And it goes back to a lot of teams wanting to leave their conference. It's slowly stripping away certain parts of this sport that make it unique and make it specific and make me love it in a lot of ways. So obviously not the greatest thing when you're losing names like Ryan Grubb, like Liam Cohen, like Jeff Hafley, but also there are tons of people, and this goes back to the conference thing, there are tons of people that are finding their way to the SEC or the Big Ten because it's the steady ship, right? There are tons of conferences out there that don't really know what their future holds. And the main example of this recently in a coach leaving for a position that they used to not leave for is Sean Elliott, the head coach of Georgia State, leaving to be the tight end coach and run game coordinator at South Carolina. Now, there is some extenuating circumstances here. It is apparently his family has been living in Columbia for the past several years, and he would like to spend more time with them. Obviously, cannot knock a man for that. There's no issue with that by any means, of course, but it is something to watch. This is not something that used to happen. A head coach of a G5 program leaving to be a position coach or run game coordinator at a bigger conference. And another example of this would be Maurice Lindquist leaving the head coaching job at Buffalo to be the DB coach and co-defensive coordinator, which definitely plays a part in all of this, at Alabama. But it's a differing landscape more and more, and I think coaches are taking note of that. The coaches in the Sun Belt, in the MAC, in Conference USA, wherever it is, are slowly realizing they have very little control over what the future looks like for not only them, but for their program, for their kids, for a lot of different aspects in their life. And they look around and see a sinking ship and see the SEC and the Big Ten, continuing to rise in all of this, and say, why not, take a lower job in terms of title, in terms of decision making, but be on a steady ship. Be on a ship that I can slowly work my way up the ranks. Possibly, if you're a good coach, you're gonna find a way to get a bigger job and a bigger job and a bigger job, right? So, all these guys, Maurice Lindquist, Sean Elliott, both those guys, very talented coaches, and they both had head coaching jobs. So it's interesting to see them give up that position to just be in a place of stability and at least know that, when you come to work in 2025 or 2026, there's still going to be a conference there. There's still going to be teams to play. There's still going to be, people watching. So it is not what I want for the sport. It's not what a lot of people want for the sport, but it's kind of the reality at this point. It takes away a lot of the tiering of this sport, because obviously there is a big gap between the SEC and the Big Ten and everyone else. There's a big gap between even the Big 12 and the ACC and the Sun Belt and the MAC and all of that. And I fully understand that. The level of play at the MAC level is not the same as the SEC, and there's no two ways about that. But watching the MAC on Tuesday and seeing really good players come across your screen is part of what makes the sport great. Seeing really good coaches make their way from the MAC level, from the NAIA level, up to a Power 5 job is part of what makes the sport great. And it could be something that doesn't necessarily fully go away, but we could see coaches leaving those levels even sooner and becoming position coaches at these bigger places like Sean Elliott did, and slowly work their way up the ranks because they're plenty talented coaches. Why not be in a stable situation where you can, get a job within that conference instead of fighting tooth and nail just to kind of stay alive in your own? So there is a lot of worry, obviously, in the coaching area and in college football today. NIL and the transfer portal have created a ton of worry around college football fans, but I tend to believe all of this will be worked out. Now, I don't know how soon that'll be. I don't know necessarily how great the final result will be. I think it'll be two big conferences in a lot of ways. It will be the SEC and the Big Ten kind of gobbling up the whole sport in some ways. But I do think at some point there will be people that come along that actually have the sport's best interests at heart and, care about the, sanctity of what makes this sport special, which in some ways is tradition and in some ways is the regionality of this sport and keeping some things in conferences the same. leaving money out of it, which is a problem, in the sports world in general. And, seeing it from a fan's perspective that doesn't get a cut of these checks by any means. So, there's tons to still happen around college football. There's tons that will happen, in the next couple of weeks with regard to all of this. But I tend to believe there are people out there that see what's happening and will take over at some point. And it'll be interesting to see who those people are and what their ideas are. But I do think there are enough people out there that see the problems that are happening in college football and want to fix them. So I'm interested to see what happens with that. But we're going to stop talking about the morbid parts of this sport real quick. We're going to take a short break, and when we come back, we're going to break down the best coaching hires of this cycle in college football. Definitely a couple of guys that really, really stand out. So stick with us, and we will be right back.
For the best and latest podcasts available anywhere, go to the podcast app on your cell phone and type in GSMC to access free content-rich podcasts on health and wellness, book reviews, sports, entertainment, relationships, social media, movies, technology, finance, and even weird news. Subscribe and download the GSMC Podcast Network's family of shows, available everywhere podcasts are found.
Alrighty, welcome back. We just talked about some of the coaching crises going on in college football. There are plenty of them, but a lot of coaches moving on to the NFL for a better work-life balance, which is a whole can of worms, and a lot of coaches moving to the SEC and the Big Ten a little bit earlier than some coaches would for positions that maybe they wouldn't have in the past. So a lot of stuff happening on that front. But let's talk about the good stuff happening in coaching, and let's talk about the best hires that have happened in this cycle. There definitely have been a ton of high-level hires, some from the NFL level, some getting, normal, title raises, some working their way up in the industry, and some guys just taking a job because it's the more comfortable situation. So, but let's start in Baton Rouge, Louisiana, because I think they made a ton of really, really good hires, but I think the two that really, really stood out to me are Bo Davis and Kevin Peoples, both D-line coaches. Bo Davis, more of an interior defensive line guy, obviously did wonders at Texas with Tavondre Sweat and Byron Murphy this past year, and then Kevin Peoples, kind of an edge-rushing guy, outside linebackers in some way. Both these guys are just elite developers of football players. Obviously, Bo Davis, I talked about, Tavondre Sweat and Byron Murphy. Byron Murphy looks to be possibly a first-round pick. We will definitely break down the draft as it approaches more and more. And I think it's something that a guy like Mason Smith has got to be not necessarily kicking himself. He's a plenty talented guy and definitely could find his way in the NFL. But I think if you were to come back for another year, it would have been pretty incredible to see what Bo Davis could have done for the development of him. And then Kevin Peoples coming over from Missouri with Blake Baker, the new defensive coordinator there, just an uber talented guy at just getting the most out of players. Missouri wasn't necessarily littered with talent. Now, there was plenty of talent at Missouri a year ago, but just got the most out of all of his guys. That defense played really, really fast, and especially on the defensive line, they were very disruptive in a number of ways, and Kevin Peoples was a huge part of that. And also brought in, was a huge part of the recruitment of Williams-Nwaneri, who is currently up in Mizzou and, a huge guy for them coming into this year. So two guys that, LSU fans have to feel great about having on campus. And also, along with Blake Baker's really aggressive play calling style in pass rushes and different stuff like that, there could be plenty of guys on this LSU defensive line that absolutely blow up next year. There could, there's not necessarily the prerequisite number of dudes that you're used to seeing necessarily across the LSU line, but there's still plenty of them, don't get me wrong. So Bo Davis and Kevin Peoples, I think, were fantastic hires, and I think they'll really show what they're worth in 2024. And as you've seen over the past couple of years at Texas, Bo Davis is worth a whole lot. So it'll be interesting to see what happens there. Also, a pretty remarkable, one of the weirder coaching hires of this entire cycle, Chip Kelly finding his way to Columbus to be the new offensive coordinator. Now, there are obviously some things going on behind the scenes at UCLA that was not making Chip Kelly super happy. That is very clear to me at this point, because it doesn't happen very often that a guy leaves a head coaching job in the same conference to go be an OC at another team in that conference. So it's very weird. I won't lie to you. Him and Ryan Day do have some history. He was the offensive coordinator at New Hampshire while Ryan Day was the quarterback there. So there is a little bit of familiarity there. But from a football perspective, an absolute slam dunk. This might be the best hire of the entire cycle, if I'm being totally honest. There are plenty of really good hires, but when you get a guy with that much head coaching experience, and a guy that has had that much success, especially on the offensive side of the ball, it's always a win. And Ohio State's going to have the prerequisite talent to work with there. So when it comes to looking at this Ohio State team going into next year, it's hard not to be excited about them. And I'll get into them a little bit more in the top 10 segment coming up here in a second. But I think he will get the most out of this run game, which is really where the key is for this team in this season. Will Howard is not necessarily an elite runner, but is definitely more than capable. And then Quinshon Judkins and Travion Henderson are just an elite running back duo. I think the best in the country. So I think that's really where they'll make their money. And then Will Howard's just got to execute. And that's what he's been doing for 4 years while at Kansas State. And I'm sure he will do that while at Ohio State. So he's definitely someone I will be keeping my eye on. Chip Kelly, I think, will get the most out of him. But another guy that took a coordinator job, at a big school was Kane Womack, who came over to Bama to join Kalen DeBoer's staff from South Alabama. This guy that Bama really needs on defense. I think he is a huge energy guy, and with a head coach that has an offensive background, you need a guy that can take over a defense that had Nick Saban in the past however long, pretty much my entire childhood. So bringing in someone with this much energy, I think, helps a ton. But also, the dude can really coach football. He gets the most out of his talent. Like we talked about with Kevin Peoples, he's a very, very aggressive play caller like Blake Baker at LSU. So he has, a ton going for him, obviously. And then the staff around him is very good. Eddie Reese is an incredible guy to have on staff, an associate head coach there. So he will be a huge help, no doubt about that. And then, obviously, having Maurice Lindquist, a former head coach, on staff. They have a ton of really, really good people in that room. So he will have a ton of people to lean on, which obviously helps. And then Nick Saban will be somewhere around that he could probably pick his brain a little bit, which doesn't hurt by any means. But another defensive coordinating hire that happened at a team that Alabama wishes it didn't happen at is Charvarius Robinson take the co-defensive coordinator and safeties job at UGA. And I think this might be my favorite and the best hire of the entire cycle. And it's not necessarily just because of what they got in Charvarius Robinson. It's because they were able to keep Will Muschamp around, which is just insane to think about, because now in that room you have Kirby Smart, Will Muschamp, Glenn Schumann, and Charvarius Robinson. All of those guys know defense more than most people in the country, most people that know anything about football. So having those four guys all in the same room, being able to bounce off of each other and, come up with incredible game plans, I'm sure, will be something to really watch here. And another thing to keep in mind here, just an elite recruiter, maybe even a better developer, but an elite recruiter got Caleb Downs to Alabama, and with guys like Malachi Starks already in the room there, it's going to be an insane group. I'll be totally honest. John Eliguero, I think, will benefit a ton from this. KJ Bolden's coming in. I think he'll benefit a ton. So it's an embarrassment of riches at Georgia, as it always is. But I think having Charvarius Robinson on staff will bring them to kind of possibly bring them, to an elite level on that back end of that defense where it's been really good at times, but there have been some holes at cornerback 2 a year ago was kind of a question mark in some ways. But having Charvarius Robinson in that room can only really help that. But the guy he took over for is another incredible hire, Fran Brown, the new head coach at Syracuse. He's created this energy around Syracuse that I have not seen in my lifetime. Now, I know Syracuse is a very storied program with a lot of very, very incredible players that have come out of there, but in my lifetime, they haven't necessarily been a huge topic of conversation in college football, and that has changed fairly quickly. Obviously, the big coup for them was getting Kyle McCord to come over from Ohio State. Obviously, Kyle McCord was not the most liked guy in Columbus this past year, but I don't think that necessarily means he won't be very popular in Syracuse. I think, obviously, the level of football is a little bit different, so the pressure on him to play perfect will not necessarily be there as much. So I think this will allow him to kind of just play free, be who he wants, and get back to just playing football, which is what all these guys just really want to do at the end of the day. So I just love this hire for a number of reasons, and one of the big reasons is the amount of guys that he has developed while at his time at Georgia is just insane. Malachi Starks, Chris Smith, Tyke Smith, Javon Bullard. There's tons of names. I can't even think of all the names right now. But he's been one of the most popular guys in Athens while his time there, and has been, super praised just around the sport overall. They were surprised he didn't take a job sooner as a defensive coordinator or something like that. So it is a very interesting thing to see, and he has one of my most interesting favorite transfer portal additions in Devin Grant, who is a safety from Buffalo. The dude absolutely flies around, and I think under Fran Brown, he could really take it to the next level. So I'm very excited to see what happens in Syracuse in the Fran Brown era. And we talked about him a second ago, but Sean Elliott, I think, is a fantastic hire, obviously, from South Carolina. Has had a ton of success while at Georgia State. Did leave like 2 days into spring practice, which is kind of an interesting dynamic that we will be following in the Georgia State program. They did have to postpone practice and the spring game for the time being, so it'll be interesting to see what happens there. But anytime you can get a head coach to come in and be a position coach for your team, it's never a bad thing by any means. So I think Sean Elliott's a home run hire for South Carolina. And then finally, a head coach again in the SEC, Mike Elko, coming from Duke over to A&M, coming back to A&M, where he was the defensive coordinator for some years under Jimbo. And I think the biggest thing here is just identity. There were a lot of times during the Jimbo Fisher era where it just felt like A&M didn't have much of an identity, whether it was offensively or defensively. It didn't feel like they were a team that was going to come out and punch you in the nose every game. They didn't feel like a team that was going to come out and outpace you, like a team like Texas, or punch you in the nose like Michigan. Or the elite teams in this sport always have a specific thing that they go back to. Always have the dudes that they go back to. Always have the concepts or the play calls or whatever it is that is kind of their fail-safe. And it always felt like A&M was kind of figuring that out on the fly every single week, and it never made for very consistent football. And I don't think that'll be a problem with Mike Elko. He shows up every single day, and he's going to play hardcore football. He's going to play really aggressive. His teams are going to be very physical. So there is obviously going to be a learning curve. You're jumping into the SEC. A&M's not necessarily at the most advantageous situation right now. But the reality is all of this will develop into what I think will be a very sustainable model for this program, which is be who you are. You're in College Station, Texas, in, kind of the middle of nowhere in some ways. You have a lot of guys that have a chip on their shoulder in some ways. Maybe they weren't recruited very hard by Texas, or maybe they got disrespected by some other programs. Maybe they, found their way to A&M through different circumstances. All you need to do is essentially play with a lot of energy, play hard, play physical, and I think you're going to have success in the long run. Now, I don't know if it's going to be in 2024, but that being said, they have a ton of talent on that team, and Mike Elko got a ton out of a Duke team that didn't have the prerequisite talent that A&M's going to have next year. So it'll be an interesting team to watch, but I think it might not be 2024, but I think in the long run, Mike Elko is going to be just incredible for this A&M team. But that's all I have for now, but there's still plenty of hires to happen. Georgia doesn't have a wide receivers coach right now. I think Bama is either gearing up or setting to hire O-line coach, which I will definitely keep a track on. But still tons of hires to happen, essentially. And so this will probably not be the last time that we do this segment. There will definitely be some additions and some people I just didn't include in this one that I will definitely include next time around. But we are going to take our last break here, and then when we come back, it is Top 10 Tuesday, the very first edition, and we will break down my way too early Top 10 for 2024. So stick around, and we will be right back. Alrighty, welcome back in. We just talked about some of the best coaching hires from this past cycle through my eyes. And now let's get into a way too early top 10. This is going to be something that we do throughout the off-season on Tuesdays, calling it Top 10 Tuesdays. Love that alliteration on my end. But so give me any ideas you guys have in the comments for ones I can do in the coming weeks. I've had thoughts of doing best college town in America. I've thought of doing top 10 quarterbacks going into next year. So open to any and all suggestions, but let me know what you think about that. But let's jump right in. Obviously, you don't necessarily. It's not going to be perfect around this time of year. It's going to be a little bit of a mixed bag and some shots in the dark in some ways, but I feel pretty good about this top four. I think a lot of people across the industry have had these top four teams kind of setting the pace for everyone else, and I think it starts with Georgia. Now, there is a big argument to be made that Ohio State could very well be above them, but when I look at the quarterback position from both those teams, it's hard to not feel confident in Carson Beck going into this year. I tend to believe he might be the best quarterback coming back this coming year. And when you have someone like Will Howard going into Ohio State, while I think he's more than capable and will have a very good year, there is still that question mark of how will everything fit together, how will everything work. So I do have Georgia and then Ohio State in the 1-2 spot, but you could call that 1A and 1B if you really wanted to. And the next two teams on this list, you absolutely could call 2A and 2B or 3A and 3B in Texas and Oregon. Texas, has Quinn Ewers coming back, obviously, for a third year, which is a huge help. Got a ton of help in the wide receiver room through the transfer portal with Isaiah Bond, Matthew Golden, Silas Bolden, tons of really, really talented guys in that room. And then the running backs with Jaden Blue and C.J. Baxter. There's tons of offensive talent, obviously, at Texas, but I think the defense will have to replace a number of pieces, obviously, up front, Tavondre Sweat and Byron Murphy being the main ones of those two that you need to replace on defense that are going to be big tasks. Obviously, they have guys like Alfred Collins and Vernon Broughton sitting right there in the wings, but you don't know how those guys are going to play until you get into spring practice and everything. But I love the foundation that's been built at Texas, and I think next year will be kind of building off what happened in 2023. But with the prerequisite talent that Georgia and Ohio State are going to have literally all over the field, Ohio State, namely Caleb Downs, who I think is the best player in all of college football, it's hard for me to put them above either of those teams. And then Oregon, getting Dylan Gabriel from the portal is obviously huge. Replacing someone like Bo Nix is not an easy thing, and they got a dude that's a lot like Bo Nix. Very, very smart, very experienced, can make a ton of different throws, and will always be ready for, any adversity that comes his way. Dylan Gabriel has dealt with injury. He's dealt with a number of different things. So if you're Oregon, you're looking at that, you're thinking we have a really tough kid that's going to be ready to roll. So I would be very encouraged by that if I was a Ducks fan. I think Dylan Gabriel is uber talented. Having Tez Johnson back is obviously a huge help. Just tons of talent all over this team. I talked about in a segment maybe last week, I think, talked about adding Jamari Caldwell and Jabbar Muhammad through the portal is absolutely huge for that defense and what Dan Lanning wants to do. So I think those are two great additions. So that's what kind of has them falling at 4. And then I have Alabama. I think there's a lot of contention around Alabama, obviously, since Nick Saban has left. There's a lot of people kind of ready to dance on Alabama's grave a little bit, I suppose. But I wouldn't be too prepared for that if I was a college football fan that really wanted Alabama to struggle. I wouldn't necessarily expect it in 2024. Now, there's still a lot up in the air, obviously. Adding a new coach, taking over for the dude and Nick Saban is never going to be an easy thing, but Kalen DeBoer can coach football, and he's going to have a ton of talent to work with. They just added Keon Saab from the portal from Michigan, which is a huge help, obviously, to that back end that has been kind of decimated since Tarvarius Robinson made his way to Georgia. But it is going to be an uber talented team. There's no two ways about that. Obviously, bringing back Jalen Milroe, he's one of the best quarterbacks in the country. There are plenty of people that have plenty to say about Jalen Milroe's ability. I tend to believe he is one of the more talented quarterbacks in the country. I don't necessarily believe he is quite up there with Quinn Ewers, Carson Beck, the elite throwers of the football that we have. But at the end of the day, he makes a ton of plays for his team, is a huge part of that offense. And with a guy coming in like Kalen DeBoer that knows so much offense and can get the most out of a run game like he did with Dylan Johnson a year ago at Washington, I think with the talent they're going to have, not only at quarterback running the ball, but Justice Haynes and Jamarian Miller are an incredible running back duo that he's going to have to work with as well. So basically what I'm saying is Alabama is still Alabama for the time being. They could show us a ton throughout this spring and into the 2024 season that could convince me otherwise. But as of right now, they're still Alabama. They still have a ton of talent, and they still have a very good coach at the helm, although it's not big man Nick Saban. But a team that hasn't really found their way into the top 10 in recent years, at least in the preseason poll, is Ole Miss. But they're right there this year, and it's a lot to do with that transfer portal class that they brought in. Jackson Dart, obviously, coming back is huge. Trey Harris is one of the best players in all of the country, but especially one of the best wide receivers in all of the country. Just tons of talent all across this team, but it comes down to Lane Kiffin, winning some games that he hasn't necessarily won in the past. You got to beat the big boys if you really want to compete in, conference championships, especially with Texas and OU coming into the fray, you got a lot to go through to get to the ACC championship and to be at the top of the sport, which is obviously what Lane Kiffin wants. They want to be in the playoff, of course, but at the end of the day, you want to compete for conference titles, especially in a conference like the SEC. And I think Ole Miss has a relatively good shot to do it. It's going to be somewhat of an uphill battle, but Jackson Dart is a very talented quarterback that really knows the Lane Kiffin offense, which is not an easy offense to fully grasp, and he obviously has full control over it now. So it'll be interesting to see what he is capable of doing this upcoming year. I think he's a guy that has a chance to make a ton of money this upcoming year in the NFL, depending on how he plays in 2024. But the team I have following them is Notre Dame, a team that a lot of people obviously are not as high on for reasons that really have nothing to do with 2024, but that's beside the point. I think bringing in Riley Leonard is kind of the same vibe of Ohio State bringing in Will Howard. It is a very, very comfortable guy that has played a ton of football, that can make all the prerequisite plays, all the prerequisite throws, is a capable runner, can do all of the things that you're going to ask him to do, and can do them really efficiently, and has done them really efficiently for a number of years. So I think he's going to be a huge help to this team, not only running the ball, throwing the ball, but in a leadership perspective. And then in the wide receiver position, I think Jaden Greathouse is a guy that is going to explode this year. He had kind of a shaky freshman year that was kind of on and off, but I would argue they were putting a little bit too much on his shoulders in terms of what they needed him to be for this team to be successful. I think that's going to kind of be subsided this year. I think not only his ability will be higher, but I think they have more dudes around him that will be able to make the prerequisite plays and be able to take a little bit of that pressure off him, which is obviously huge. Mitchell Evans is an incredible tight end that's coming back for them, has the chance to probably be the best tight end in all of college football this year. And then on the defensive end, keeping Riley Mills in the fray for this next year is huge from Notre Dame's perspective. You need that linchpin in the middle of your defense, and he's the guy, right? Tavondre Sweat was a huge effect on Texas' ability to make the playoff, and Riley Mills has the chance to have that same effect on Notre Dame if he can be super disruptive the way he was a year ago, and has really proven to be an elite defensive tackle in this, in the college football world. But let's keep working our way down the list here. I got Missouri at 8, above Michigan, which I know looks a little bit weird, but this Missouri team is obviously building something. I talked about Williams Nawari, adding him as an elite 5-star edge rusher is the ultimate help to this defense, especially losing Darius Robinson in that position this past year. But the main two reasons I'm picking this is Brady Cook's coming back, which is huge. Having a quarterback that understands the playbook. I talked about this with Jackson Dart. Quinn Ewers is a big part of this. Carson Beck. Knowing the playbook is a lot of the battle in college football for these quarterbacks, and Brady Cook knows it inside and out. And then Luther Burden, who, other than Caleb Downs, you'd be hard-pressed to find a better football player in all of the country than Luther Burden, and I think he's going to have not only a Biletnikoff-type year, could very well win it, but he's going to be huge for this team in so many different ways. And guess what? They also have Mookie Cooper and Theo Weiss right there next to him. So it's kind of an embarrassment of riches when it comes to that wide receiver room in Columbia, Missouri. So I would not be surprised if they were firmly a part of the SEC conversation. Now, I currently have 4 SEC teams above them, even though they're in the 8th spot. So just keep that in mind when we're talking about these teams going forward. But I really do love what Eli Drinkwitz is building up there, and I think he will continue to do that in 2024. And then I got 2 Big Ten teams to finish it out, Michigan and then Penn State. I kind of flip-flopped on this a little bit leading up to the show. I think there are a lot of things to like about Penn State. I think Drew Aller is going to kind of turn a corner in 2024 and have a little bit more of consistent play. Obviously, adding Julian Fleming in the portal is huge. But when it comes to Michigan, I know exactly what Michigan is going to be, right? I know that Sharon Moore is going to run the ball a lot. Wink Martindale is still kind of a question mark at defensive coordinator in terms of what he's going to run and the identity he's going to play with. But I know exactly what I'm getting from Michigan week in, week out, because there is an ingrained culture there that is left over from the Jim Harbaugh era that I believe Sherrone Moore will carry right on into 2024. And I don't necessarily have that comfort level with Penn State. Not that Penn State isn't capable of, being right there in that conversation, but there is a question mark with adding two new coordinators, Drew Allard not being necessarily as consistent as you would have liked in 2023. So there are a lot of question marks with Penn State that I just don't see quite as often with Michigan. Now, there are some worry spots with Michigan, but I tend to just believe in the overall program to kind of supersede some of those holes and some of those issues more so than at Penn State. But Penn State is absolutely a team that could be working their way up these rankings even before the year starts for me. But then especially when the year starts, I think they're a team that a lot of people like to overlook because of their shortcomings in the previous years. But I think they're more than talented. I think they're more than capable. So I think they'll be more than fine. And then finally, just some quick honorable mentions. LSU, I do believe in this team. I think they added, obviously, a great defensive coordinator in Blake Baker from Missouri, added two great defensive line coaches. But Garrett Nussmeier, I have ultimate belief in to be the dude. They added C.J. Daniels, a wide receiver from Liberty. That's going to be a huge help. So I really like this LSU team. I don't necessarily think they'll be able to necessarily compete for the SEC. Having 5 SEC teams in the top 10 will do that to you, but I think they'll be a plenty good team. Another team in the SEC that's like that is Oklahoma. I think they are very good. Obviously, flipping from 6-7 in 2022 to 10-2 in 2023 is a remarkable improvement in the Brent Venables era, and it feels like he's slowly kind of getting that identity, that that group on defense that he really, really wants. And I think it's going to be a huge help to him going into the SEC. And then I really like Jackson Arnold. Now there is that question of if Jackson Arnold goes down, is the backup Casey Thompson, who just came in on his, I think, 7th year in college football, to be the backup there? Or, do they struggle like they have in recent years when Dylan Gabriel's gone out? So that's definitely something to keep your eye on. And then Arizona and Clemson, two teams that Arizona is kind of moving in an upward trajectory. Clemson kind of slowly moving down. But I think Garrett Riley at Clemson, I think, will be able to get a little bit more comfortable in that situation and be able to call a little bit more comfortable of an offense for Cade Klubnik in 2024, which will lead to success for sure. And Clemson's always going to have the talent on the defensive line to play, so I'm not super worried about that. Peter Woods was an elite player as a freshman a year ago, so I really like them. And then Arizona, obviously building off the success of last year, did lose Jed Fish, but I really like Brett Brennan as a head coach. And then bringing back Noah Fafita into Torrey McMillan is just ridiculous. In this new world of transfer portal, everyone would have thought that they were going straight to Washington, but they decided to stay in Tucson, and that's just a huge win for this staff. And I think it could be the difference between them being a 7-5 team and them being a real contender in the Big 12 and possibly even in the playoffs. So this is my general thoughts this early on in the process. This is very much subject to change with spring practice coming up and everything like that. But that will do it for this edition of the GSMC College Football Podcast presented by the GSMC Sports Network. Your support means a lot to us. Please remember to subscribe and leave a positive review. It absolutely really does help all of our stuff around different social pages. And follow all those social pages on Facebook, Twitter, TikTok, and Instagram for all the updates. We release tons of content throughout the day across every sport, so we will keep you up to date with whatever you need. But thank you once again for listening, and I will see you next time.
Let's go. I wake up to a little bit of drool on my pillow, feel like it's gonna be a